It is a warm evening in an oasis village of the Tarim Basin, and a circle of Uyghur villagers gathers under the grapevine trellis. Standing in the center is an elderly man recounting a beloved tale. A mother sheep and her lamb outwit a ravenous wolf on the summer pastures. As the wolf licks his chops, the clever sheep persuades him to wait a little while until their return journey, where they'll be a little bit fatter and better to taste. Months later, with the wolf lying in ambush, a quick-witted hare appears, claiming they be an envoy of the Chinese emperor sent to collect wolf skins. Well, the wolf flees in terror, and the audience, upon hearing the crescendo of the story, erupts into laughter. It's a lively scene, and while it's made up for dramatic effect for the introduction, it captures the essence of Uyghur folklore. That is that rich tapestry of oral literature, brimming with its talking animals, clever tricksters, mythical creatures, and of course, moral lessons. In this folklore, it's a world where humor and wisdom help the weak triumph over the powerful, and where centuries of history and cultural influence are preserved in stories with much deeper meanings. And so today, continuing our folklore series, we're talking about the culture of the Uyghurs. It's going to be an interesting one today, I think. I hope you're enjoying following along with the playlist. So before we begin, allow me to just welcome you to the channel. If you are new here, perhaps you'll click that subscribe button. A like and comment also help push us out in the algorithm. And a reminder, this video and all videos on this channel are 100% mid-roll free. No pesky interruptions. It's all about your experience and enjoyment. We are supported by the members on Patreon, YouTube memberships, super thanks and PayPal donations, and also those who check out the merch store. If you are interested in any of those links, you may navigate to the pinned comment, video and channel description. Now, with that out of the way, let us begin. So first of all, like many ancient cultures, the Uyghurs possess a body of myths that seek to explain the origins of the world, humanity, and of course their own place within global history. And while much of this mythology was transmitted orally and only written down much later, scholars have identified a few recurring themes that align with broader Turkic mythological traditions and echo with the religious history of the region, which, well, is admittedly quite complicated. In fact, the very concept of mythology was recognized by Uyghur scholars over 1,000 years ago. The 11th century lexicographer Mahmud al-Kashgari noted in his compendium of the Turkic dialects that the Turkic word koshmak or kam referred to an ancient oral narrative and stories of deified heroes. Well, this early acknowledgement reminds us that Uyghur mythic storytelling certainly has deep roots. And of course, Uyghur creation myths exhibit patterns found across Central Asia. One common motive is the earth diver theme. Now, this was basically the theme where the world was initially a vast sea, until a divine or heroic figure helped form the more solid parts of it. In some variants, a deity sends an animal, often a water bird, to dive to the depths and fetch mud or sand that expands into the continents. Other versions speak of the sky, and earth once being joined until a primordial being split them apart to form up the larger universe. But these tales are only fragmentarily recorded, which is unfortunate, but still they carry echoes of the ancient Tengirist beliefs of the early Turkic tribes, centered on the sky god Tengir and the sacred union of the sky and the earth. So we can only imagine early Uyghur shamans reciting such cosmogonic stories around campfires, imparting a sense of that cosmic order and divine origin into their nomadic world. Now, one particularly important mythic narrative is the legend of Oguz Kagan, semi-divine warrior ancestor. This epic legend, known in various Turkic traditions, holds special significance in Uyghur folklore as well. Oguz Kagan is depicted as a prodigious hero, born with mysterious marks and extraordinary abilities. And there's an old legend that says he spoke his first words as a mere infant and was hunting wild beasts by the time he was 3 years old. As a young man, Oguz undertook heroic quests, fighting monsters, uniting the tribes under his leadership, this kind of thing. The saga describes how he divided his domain among his 6 sons, who became founders of the great Turkic tribes. In one poetic Uyghur rendition of this tale, the birth of Oguz is described in pretty striking imagery. The infant hero's face, bluish, sky blue with eyes glowing like coals, who after only 40 days could walk and speak with the wisdom of a fully grown adult. Now, this origin story has been called one of the great poetic epics of the Uyghur tradition, linking Uyghurs to a prestigious lineage that includes distant Turkic and even Mongolic relatives. Notably, an old manuscript of the Oguz Kagan epic in the Uyghur script was found in Turpan, suggesting that the Uyghurs had adopted and localized this legend by at least the medieval era. Well, through this legend, the Uyghurs assert a proud identity as descendants of a divinely sanctioned ruler. A pretty powerful narrative, especially when one considers that the real Uyghur states rose and fell over the centuries. In any case, before the advent of world religions, the Uyghurs and their predecessors practiced forms of shamanism and nature worship. Traces of these early beliefs survive in the folklore. We have things like sky gods, sacred mountains, and animistic spirits. The old Turkic belief that wolves were ancestral protectors, for example, is reflected in the legends of wolves guiding or nurturing progenitors of Turkic clans, i.e., the Grey Wolf legend. We'll get to that a little later, but one Uyghur myth tells of a young boy who survived of a great battle. A she-wolf nourished him in a hidden valley, and from their union sprang the forefathers of various tribes. Now, this is just one of the stories, at least surrounding wolves, and such myths serve to sacralize the lineage of clans, connecting them symbolically to the vitality and cunning of the wolf, a revered totemic animal, of course. Additionally, reverence for the sun, the moon, and the stars also appear in some stories. For instance, in certain folk songs and tales, the sun and the moon, named Kun and Ai, are personified as benevolent forces guiding the people. Of course, in later times, Islam became dominant, and it remains so in Uyghur cultures today. But these older mythic symbols did not vanish overnight. Instead, they often blended into new narratives or lived on as folk superstitions. As for the Uyghur homeland, it is historically known as Turkestan, and it saw an overlay of multiple religions: shamanism, Buddhism, Manichaeism, Islam, Nestorian Christianity. Each one of them, of course, left quite a mark on the folklore. Let's take, for example, from the Buddhist period, as around the 9th to 12th century, when Uyghurs in the Turpan region were predominantly Buddhist, we have an intriguing tale. Things like magical monks, Naga-like dragons, and concepts of reincarnation show up in Uyghur folk stories long after Buddhism waned. A character known as Persian, from the word Bishu for a monk, appears in several tales as a hermit or sorcerer with supernatural powers, a likely remnant of Buddhist lore, later understood through an Islamic lens, even as a kind of mystic or a wizard/monk, Similarly, Manichaean influence possibly survives in the moral dualism of certain legends, where cosmic battles of light and dark are hinted at. In any case, after the 10th century, Islamic cosmology and legendary took center stage. Uyghur myths began to incorporate prophets and saints. Creation stories might be retold a little to align with Islamic teachings, referencing Allah shaping Adam from clay, etc. And flood myths merged with the Quranic story of Noah. Well, yet intriguingly, even as these global religions were adopted, the Uyghurs often localized them. One local legend claims that at the dawn of time, Eden itself was located in the lush oasis of Kashgar, a way of placing Uyghur land at the heart of the sacred geography of the world. But like many cultures, Uyghur folklore has tales of ancient disasters, floods, droughts, celestial events, and the heroes who once rescued humanity. If you want to know a little bit more about the flood myths, I did a whole video on global flood myths a couple months ago, depending on when you're watching this, I suppose. In any case, one popular myth recounts a massive flood that once covered the Tarim Basin completely. But humanity, they got lucky. They were saved by a benevolent figure. In Islamic versions, it's Noah or Noh. In older versions, perhaps some kind of shaman king who built a great vessel just in the nick of time. Of course, some renditions localize the story. A high mountain in the region is pointed out as the place where the ark finally came to rest, and life had a chance to begin anew. And then there's another legend that speaks of a hero archer who shot down extra suns in the sky when a calamitous heat threatened the world. A pretty obvious parallel to the well-known Chinese myth of Hou Yi, indicating how cross-cultural contact on the Silk Road could introduce foreign mythic motives into Uyghur oral tradition. Over time, these disaster myths likely serve to impart both a warning about human folly, but also a hopeful message that exceptional heroes or divine mercy can deliver people from the catastrophe. Now, before we move on to the next section, in analyzing the Uyghur folklore and mythology, we can pretty much classify the narratives into different categories, that being creation myths, flood and catastrophe myths, origin of civilization myths, and time and space origin stories, and so on. Now, the broad range of themes shows that Uyghur mythic lore, though not as extensively recorded as Greek or Indian mythologies, is indeed comprehensive in its scope. These myths provided early Uyghur societies with a framework to understand the natural world, and of course their destiny within it. And even in modern times, echoes of these ancient myths persist in festivals, idioms, and archetypes of later folk tales. And there's plenty of festivals going on in Xinjiang, especially in Urumqi. Yes, they seem to have them going all the time. It's one big party over there. Well, studying them gives us a glimpse of the world view of the Uyghur ancestors. Certainly a world teeming with all sorts of folkloric elements. But it also shows us how successive layers of belief were absorbed, with shamanic myths giving way to Buddhist miracles, and those in turn Islamicized into legends of prophets and saints. In any case, the end result is quite complex. Syncretic mythology that is uniquely Uyghur, reflecting that spiritual odyssey of the people, a very interesting part of the world, the crossroads of Asia. So let's move on from the primordial myths to more human-scale legends. These stories that we find, the epics, the legends, and historical tales, often blur the line between myth and history. Real figures existed, and real events happened, but they are embellished with a bit of fantastical element, while fictional heroes are treated with the reverence of history sometimes too. The Uyghur epic tradition is closely tied to that of other Turkic peoples, yet it has distinct flavors. So let's consider some of the most prominent legendary narratives and figures that are cherished by Uyghurs even till today. First, we have Dastan and the oral epic tradition. The Uyghur term Dastan refers to epic narratives, usually long oral poems or prose tales that recount the adventures of heroes, lovers, or saints. For centuries, these dastans were performed by itinerant bards or story singers in bazaar squares and at communal gatherings, accompanied by the gentle strumming of the two-stringed dutar or the rhythmic pulse of a framed drum. A skilled dastan storyteller could hold an audience captivated late into the night. The performance aspect is pretty important. Melody, intonation, sometimes dancing would animate the story. And it was this tradition, oral storytelling, that allowed epic stories to be preserved without the need for writing, and also allowing them to be adapted over time. Each generation of storytellers might add embellishments or perhaps local details, keeping the epics alive and relevant. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, foreign scholars like the Swede Gunnar Jarring recorded portions of these epics and noted that a good dastan performer was highly respected, often invited to weddings or festivals to recite famous tales. The existence of multiple variants of the same epic in different places, that is Kashgar, Turpan, Khotan, etc., shows how the oral epic was truly a living art, collectively owned by the people. It was everyone's and no one's all at the same time. Well, then we have Alpamish. Among the epic heroes known across Central Asia, Alpamish stands out and is present in Uyghur lore as well. He is a legendary warrior, celebrated for his strength, bravery, and above all, loyalty to his people. In the epic of Alpamish, he must rescue his betrothed bride from an enemy tribe, undergoing trials of combat, imprisonment, and separation, before ultimately reuniting with her and restoring her honor. The Alpamish tale is more strongly associated with the Uzbeks and Kazakhs, but Uyghur oral tradition also features it, sometimes under local titles, or with localized episodes. Now, in terms of the Uyghur version, it often emphasizes communal values. Alpamish fights not just for personal love, but to defend his clan's freedom against the oppressors. Itinerant Uyghur minstrels in the 19th century were known to sing verses of Alpamir, as it is pronounced locally, during summer pasture gatherings. The endurance of this epic among the Uyghurs shows the shared Turkic heritage of hero tales, and there's quite a lot of crossover, just like there is with Uyghur language and Persian language, this kind of thing. In any case, its themes of exile and return, and of upholding justice, certainly resonate in a region that often faced political upheavals. And of course, even today, Alpamish is taught as a cultural classic. Children might hear simplified prose versions of his feats, linking them to a heroic past. But then we have romantic epics, Tahir and Zuhra, Garib and Sanam. Not all stories are about war. Some are tragic romances that have become staples of folklore storytelling. The tale of Tahir and Zuhra is one such epic known in Uyghur tradition, and of course among the other Turkic peoples. It tells of two lovers, often portrayed as being inseparable as two halves of the same soul, but they are cruelly parted by fate and family opposition. Think about a Romeo and Juliet sort of thing. Tahir, a talented poet or sometimes a singer in some versions, and Zura, a beautiful noblewoman, fall deeply in love. but Zura's father forbids their union. Through poems, songs, and secret meetings, their affection only grows, but so do the obstacles. In the Kashgar variant of this epic, recorded by folklorists in the early 20th century, the narrative is filled with haunting songs. The hero's lute accompanies verses comparing their love to the moth and the flame, destined to unite, even if it means perishing. And the end. Well, it's not a good ending. It's quite tragic. Tahir dies of longing, and Zura, upon hearing of his death, dies at his graveside, only for the folk legend to claim that red roses bloomed from their joined graves. Now, this story is sometimes called the Uyghur Romeo and Juliet for obvious reasons. It emphasizes qualities admired in Uyghur culture too: fidelity, devotion, and the notion that true love transcends death. Another popular romance is Garib and Sanam, known elsewhere as Ashik Garib. In this tale, a poor youth Garib wins the heart of the maiden Sanam through his music. But to marry her, he must embark on a journey to earn wealth and status. After years of trials, including encounters with bandits and supernatural beings, he returns in disguise just in time to stop Sanam's forced marriage to another. These romantic dastans often blend love stories with moral lessons, and a few elements of the fantastical too, such as prophetic dreams or magical assistance, making them entertaining yet edifying. But they also highlight the musical side of Uyghur folklore. The hero's song, or the heroine's lament, often features as a defining moment of the narrative. Again, always this integration of poetry into the story. But Uyghur folklore also preserves legends of historical figures, elevated to almost mythological status. One such figure is Satak Bugra Khan, the 10th century prince of the Karakhanid dynasty, who is celebrated as the first Uyghur, or at least Turkic, ruler to embrace Islam. Over time, Satak Bugra Khan's biography turned into a legend, with many miraculous elements. In popular lore, he was guided by angels and could perform feats of strength thanks to his newfound faith. The Tazkirah, that is, hagiography, of Satak Bugra Khan has become part of oral literature. Storytellers would recount how as a young man Satak secretly converted to Islam, slew a fearsome infidel giant in single combat, and eventually led the rest of his people to embrace the new religion. This legend served a dual purpose. It glorified a local hero and reinforced Islamic identity by casting the conversion as a divinely ordained thing and quite heroic. Listeners hearing this story in a tea house in Kashgar around, say, 19th century or so, wouldn't only just be entertained, but they'd feel a kind of sense of pride in their Islamic heritage, and also the sanctity of their land. And by the way, his tomb in Artush near Kashgar is actually a pilgrimage site. Just a bit of trivia for you there. Now similarly, the epic of Ughuz Khan, mentioned earlier in the mythic context, doubles as a legendary history of the Uyghurs. Some Uyghur chronicles, compiled in the 17th and 18th centuries, trace the genealogy of local rulers back to Oghuz and his sons, effectively merging folklore with royal propaganda. Another beloved legendary character is Anwar Khoja and his wife Yusuf Khani, from the oral epic sometimes titled Flowers of Immortality. This tale, collected from Khotan storytellers in the 1920s, seems to be a mix of romance, moral allegory, and adventure all together. It follows the brave young man Anwar and Yusuf Khani, a wise and virtuous maiden, who endure many challenges, including being separated by an evil king and facing magical tests. In their quest to be reunited, they have to go through these trials. Ultimately, Through piety and courage, they find the mythical flower of immortality and overthrow the tyrant. The story's fantastical journey through deserts and mountains, encountering fairies and ogres, not only entertains, but is once more another way to impart a lesson about faith and integrity. But interestingly, it contains a few thinly veiled critiques of despotic rulers, which of course would resonate with the common folk living under capricious khans or warlords. But what about a more localized level? Virtually every town in Xinjiang has its own folklore and legends, explaining particular landmarks or the town's founding. All you need to do is ask an old man about it, or ask some kids even, and they'll be very keen to tell you. For example, in the oasis of Turpan, people tell the legend of the Flaming Mountains, how a mighty dragon was slain by a hero, and its blood turned into the red sandstone hills that glow under the desert sun. In Khotan, an oft-told legend recounts the discovery of jade. A poor boy follows a rainbow after a storm and finds where it touches the earth, revealing jade pebbles. Thus, Khotan's jade, famed along the Silk Road, was believed to be a heavenly gift. And then there's another charming story, that of the fragrant concubine Iparhan, the historical Uyghur woman from Kashgar, who according to the legend was so beautiful and naturally perfumed that she was brought to the Qing Emperor's courts in the 18th century. Folk embellishments claim she carried with her a piece of her homeland's soil and a sachet of local spices to preserve her Uyghur identity in Beijing, and that even the flowers would turn their heads toward her because she just smelled so good. Now, of course, the history of Iparhan is debated. The legend did take on a life of its own, though. Among Uyghurs, it became a symbol of yearning for home and resistance to some new cultural assimilation. Some versions say she tried to assassinate the emperor or refused to smile for him. A kind of quiet defiance, I suppose. In any case, all of these heroic epics and legends, they all have a common thread emerging. First, there is an emphasis on justice and morality. Heroes are valorous, but they're also righteous, and evil rulers or demons ultimately face defeat, reinforcing a moral universe where good eventually triumphs, even though it might seem very hopeless. Second, faith and destiny, they often guide the outcomes, whether it's the will of God in Islamic legends, or the degree of fate in older epics. The idea that a higher power watches over the just is prevalent. And third, we see a cultural blending. Islamic heroes might fight alongside fairy tale-like creatures, and traditional Turkic warriors might voice Sufi-like wisdom. And that is the layered heritage of the Uyghurs, absorbing various influences into their storytelling. And just finally, these stories had a bit of a didactic role. Beyond entertainment, they taught listeners about their history, instilled pride in cultural heroes, and transmitted values of courage, honor, and devotion. Now, of course, all of the most epic heroes inspire a lot of admiration, but it's often the witty characters and clever tricksters that steal people's hearts in folklore. And Uyghur folklore is especially rich in humorous fables, anecdotes, and tales. These stories, usually shorter and more anecdotal than epics, I suppose, they serve to entertain with laughter while slyly imparting lessons about human nature and the survival through cleverness. So let's have a look at a few of them, shall we? First of all, we'll look at Nasruddin Apandi. No discussion of Uyghur folklore would be complete without that. Nasruddin is a legendary witty rogue and a wise fool figure, framed throughout Turkic and Islamic worlds. And among Uyghurs too, he is a superstar of folk-telling. Now, dozens upon dozens of Nasruddin jokes and tales circulate in the Uyghur oral tradition, typically short anecdotes where Nasruddin's sharp tongue and quick thinking turn the tables on the rich and pompous. But what makes Nasruddin so endearing is his dual nature. He often plays the fool or poor beggar, but through humor and paradox, he always exposes a deeper truth or cleverly achieves justice. For the Uyghur audience, Nasruddin Apandi embodies a self-image of irreverence towards authority and the triumph of the underdog's wit. As one scholar quipped, his stories reinforce a Uyghur's self-image of irreverence for those in positions of power, valorizing witty retorts and disdain for protocol in public life. Well, consider one classic Nasruddin tale often told in Uyghur communities, the Effendi and the Pot. Nasruddin Apandi once borrowed a large pot from a wealthy neighbor, and when he returned it, he placed a small pot inside the large one. Now the neighbor was surprised and asked the question, "What is the little pot?" And Nasruddin gravely replied, "Congratulations, your pot gave birth while it was in my care." Well, the greedy neighbor was delighted by this miraculous gain, but later eagerly lent Nasruddin his prized copper cauldron too. But this time, Nasruddin failed to return it. When the man came angrily to demand his pot back, Nasruddin sighed and said, "I'm sorry to tell you, but your pot has died." The neighbor was not happy with that, but Nasruddin shrugged. If a pot can give birth, surely it can die too. The neighbor was left speechless, and the listeners burst into laughter at the Appendi's logic. Well, beneath the humor lies a sharp critique of greed and gullibility. Nasruddin wins by using a powerful man's own absurd logic against him. In countless such anecdotes, Nasruddin tricks those greedy misers, outwits tyrannical khans or crooked judges, and even pokes fun at himself to deflate others' pretensions. And each tale is quite short, often just a setup and a punchline, and that makes the story easy to remember and retell. They function almost like jokes or parables, simple enough for children to enjoy, yet layered with enough insight for adults to appreciate. The Nasruddin tales likely entered Uyghur folklore during the Islamic period by Central Asian intermixing. They originated around the 13th century in Persia/Turkey, and then spread widely. By the 20th century, Nasruddin Apandi was so ingrained in Uyghur culture that compilations of his stories were printed in Uyghur and Chinese, and even used for subtle social commentary. For instance, a 1982 collection titled The Effendi and the Pregnant Pot, translated by Gigliesi, highlighted stories where Nasruddin shows the abuses of rulers and the wisdom of the common folk, aligning neatly with the socialist ideals of critiquing feudal lords. Such tales, like one where Nasruddin visits a prison with a king, also called a padishah in Uyghur, and finds only one truly guilty man inside, all the others claiming innocence, prompting him to urge the king to free the one guilty man, lest he corrupt all of the innocent souls around him in jail. Using comedy again to make a rather barbed statement about justice. Now, Uyghurs have historically savored this aspect. Through Nasruddin, they could safely mock authority and laugh at the powerful, a subtle form of resistance throughout the medieval and even close to modern times, where dissent was dangerous. You find the same too in Qing dynasty times in China too. Now today the character of Apandi is quite iconic. You'll find him depicted in Uyghur cartoons, puppet shows, and even in a theme park in Kashgar called Apandiland. People still swap Nasruddin jokes, each with that familiar setup. One day Nasruddin Apandi was asked something, and then you know that a clever punchline is coming. This popularity is a testament to the universal appeal of that same archetype of the trickster who speaks truth to power in a bit of a cheeky way. But then we also have the animal tales and fables that often carry their own morals. Many of these resemble Aesop's fables, or even Panchatantra tales, showing the influence of the broader Asian traditions of storytelling. The story of the wolf, the sheep, and the hare was one that we saw in the introduction. That's a perfect example. The weak, the sheep and the lamb, survive by their wits, and with the cooperation of another clever creature, the hare, defeat the strong but rather foolish oppressor, the wolf. Such tales typically reinforce values of cooperation, cleverness, and sometimes just the pragmatic lesson of work smarter, not harder. Another common motive is the friendship or rivalry of unlikely animals. For instance, there is a Uyghur story of the fox and the raven and the wolf. In one variant, the fox and raven form a pact to get food. They trick a greedy wolf by making him think that the sky is falling, or that a hunter is near, causing the wolf to abandon his feast, which the fox and the raven then share. At the end, the wolf is left hungry, and, well, a little damaged of his pride, teaching that greed and arrogance lead to downfall. Children love these stories, especially the ones about talking animals, but they're also cautionary lessons. A sly fox stands in for the clever poor man, while the blundering wolf or boastful bear represents a bully or an unjust ruler. Interestingly, certain animals carry culturally specific symbolism. The hare, the rabbit, in Uyghur tales is frequently the trickster hero, much like the European fox. Well, as noted in one review of Uyghur folklore collections, the hare's prominent role reflects the significance of the hare as a mythological figure in many cultures. And that's not just Uyghur or Turkic cultures either. It's quite common all over the world. Now, in contrast to that, the camel might be depicted as proud and foolish. There's a story explaining why the camel has a short tail. It was punished for its arrogance originally, whereas the mule often plays the long-suffering everyman character. One humorous fable tells of a boastful donkey who insists he can sing like a nightingale, only to be beaten by villagers covering their ears. Pretty straightforward admonition against pretending to be something you're not. And then there are fantastical creatures, giants, dragons, and imps, that kind of thing. They occasionally appear too, sometimes borrowed from Chinese or Persian lore, but once again localized in their setting. A one-eyed giant called Dev Asbab figures in a tale where he demands a village sacrifice youths to him, until a brave girl outwits him in a fashion that is quite reminiscent of Scheherazade, by telling him never-ending riddles that drive him mad. Well, apart from Nasruddin, Uyghur anecdotes include other recurring comic characters. Let's talk about the mullah and everyday humor. Sometimes a foolish mullah or village cleric, a stingy merchant, or a henpecked husband feature in their own stories. Jokes about bumbling religious teachers who misquote scripture, or a miser who ends up tricking himself are quite popular, reflecting a general skepticism towards hypocrisy and excessive piety when divorced from common sense. For instance, one joke says, a mullah was asked, "What's more important, the sun or the moon?" And he answered, "The moon, because it shines at night when we need light, whereas the sun shines in the daytime when there's already plenty of light around." This silly logic pokes fun at presumably a learned man's folly, a gentle way for ordinary folk to assert their own practical wisdom over hollow erudition. And here's another anecdote. A man asks his miserly friend to loan him a rope. The friend says, "Sorry, I'm using it to tie up flour." Well, he asks him, "Who ties up flour with a rope?" And he replies, "Well, if I don't want to lend it, any excuse is good enough." It's a wry and sarcastic humor, beloved by Uyghurs, often delivered with a straight face. Dryness. And such everyday jokes likely peppered conversations historically in the tea houses of towns like Yarkand and Yengisar. They create a sense of shared humor, and importantly too, a kind of social adhesive. Alongside narrative tales, Uyghur folklore includes a vast repertoire of proverbs and sayings, and these seem to encapsulate wisdom in a more concise form. The proverbs cover aspects of, well, pretty much all forms of everyday life: work, faith, family, human nature. For example, a Uyghur proverb says, the fool of a horse, the fowl of a horse rather, plays in the dust, meaning that children follow the example of their upbringing, just as the fowl imitates its mother's habits. Another common saying, the wound of the tongue does not heal, a warning about the lasting harm of saying something hurtful to somebody, emphasizing the culture's stress on courtesy and careful speech. So during the mid-20th century, researchers like Gunnar Yaring collected thousands of such proverbs from different Uyghur regions. They found that while some proverbs are unique to the Uyghurs' environment, except for references to dust, camels, mulberry trees, things like that, many have universal equivalents, showing the common human experience between these cultures. For instance, a Uyghur might say, "Chase 2 rabbits, and you won't catch either of them." Essentially the same wisdom as don't try and serve 2 masters, don't try and do 2 things at once, this kind of thing. Proverbs often get invoked in daily conversation and traditional storytelling as punchlines or morals. A folktale might conclude explicitly with a proverb to drive home its point, or a speaker might preface it with advice such as the old people say, followed by a rhyming proverb. Never really get too tired of hearing of them, as long as they're not there to beat you over the head with that kind of practical wisdom. But what do these trickster tales and fables, all these little jokes and parables, tell us about Uyghur culture and values? Well, importantly, they champion the underdog. The heroes are rarely kings or wealthy nobles. More often, they are poor peasants, tailors, shepherds, animals symbolic of the common man, like a little rabbit versus a wolf or a sheep versus a wolf, this kind of thing. Victories are achieved not through might or magic bestowed by birth, but through cleverness, quick thinking, and sometimes even just plain cheek. It's a bit different from the Greek tradition. We think of things like Odysseus and all that sort of thing. These great kings going out to do heroic sagas and all the rest. It's a little bit more grassroots level. In any case, all traditions are equally as interesting, I think. But of course we have to mention that folklore is not only found in spoken or written tales. Among the Uyghurs, it vividly manifests in dance, music, and performing arts that have been transmitted alongside stories. Now, I don't know if you watch the yearly Chinese New Year performances that CCTV puts on, but pretty much every year they'll have this fantastic sort of Uyghur cultural expedition that they put on. And usually it's a big dance thing, and they wear their traditional outfits and everything, or tell a short story. They'll usually have one of these at the annual New Year Gala. I always look forward to that, always something unique. In any case, in Uyghur culture, telling a story is often a multi-sensory experience. A tale might be sung, accompanied by instruments, or acted out in this communal setting. It's an interweaving of narrative with music and movement does produce some of the most treasured elements of Uyghur heritage, such as the 12 mukam and the lively meshrep gatherings. So, let's talk a bit about that now, starting with the 12 mukam, the crown jewel of Uyghur traditional music and oral art is undoubtedly the iki mukam, or the 12 mukam. Now, the mukam is a large suite of songs, instrumental pieces, spoken interludes that together can last for hours. Collectively, the 12 mukam comprise a monumental repertoire often likened to an encyclopedia of Uyghur folk music and oral literature. And in fact, in 2005, UNESCO recognized the Uyghur mukam of Xinjiang as a masterpiece of oral and intangible heritage of humanity, showing once again its great significance. But what exactly is in these mukam? Well, each one is essentially a musical mode or suite, often associated with a certain mood or time of the day, containing multiple sections, around 20 to 30 songs and instrumental melodies that progress from slower, contemplative pieces to fast, dance-like conclusions, a kind of crescendo at the end. The lyrics of mukam songs are drawn from diverse sources, of course. Some are folk lyrics from ancient times. Others come from classical Uyghur poetry, especially from the 18th century poetess Amanisa Khan, who is traditionally credited with systematizing the 12 mukam. And still, others are snippets of love stories or perhaps moral tales. In performance, a small ensemble plays lutes like dutar or fiddles like gijak, frame drums like dap, and sometimes flutes, while one or more singers alternate between singing and doing the narration. A full mukam performance is a feat of endurance and skill. It often takes 1 to 2 hours per mukam suite. Performing all 12 in a cycle, well, that could go for days. Historically speaking, these mukam were performed at courts and elite gatherings, but they have their roots in folk weddings and communal celebrations as well. Folklore content is prominent in the lyrical narratives of the mukam. For instance, one song in the mukam might recount the plight of a lovelorn hero separated from his beloved, echoing the themes of romantic dastans we mentioned earlier. And another might be a playful wedding song, full of a bit of innuendo and folk wisdom for newlyweds. An instrumental section might be traditionally linked to a legend, such as Mushavir, which local musicians say was inspired by the sound of a legendary horse or the ambience of a particular oasis at night. Thus, while mukam music is music, well, it's also storytelling through song. Listeners are expected to catch the references to famous literary tales or beloved folklore characters in the lyrics. In one mukam ballad, the singer might suddenly adopt the persona of Majnun, the archetypal mad lover from Middle Eastern lore, or cite a line of advice uttered by Nasruddin Apandi, weaving the fabric of shared folklore into a single performance. While the transmission of mukam was traditionally oral, master passing it on to apprentice, much like the telling of folk tales. In the 20th century, especially during the cultural policies of the 50s, mukam were collected, notated, and formally taught to preserve them. Even so, in Uyghur communities to this day in Xinjiang, a great mukam singer is revered as a custodian of culture, someone who carries the memory and melodies of their people, the emotive soul of the culture. When an elder musician performs a mukam at a family festival, the room often becomes hushed as the familiar strains and words evoke collective nostalgia. It's like the ancestors are speaking right to them. While alongside music, dance is a vital medium of folklore expression. Uyghur dance is renowned for its grace, rhythmic footwork, and expressive hand movements. Often dances are tied to specific stories or symbolic meanings. For example, the Samani dance, traditionally performed during the harvest or New Year, is said to originate from an ancient legend of peasants stamping down grain and celebrating the bounty. Over time, this evolved into a stylized dance, imitating those motions, preserving in art the memory of an agrarian ritual. Another beloved dance is the Dolan Meshrep dance of the Dolan Uyghurs, which involves energetic leaps and spins. Local lore connects it to the old heroic tales of hunters and warriors displaying their prowess. And even the delicate turning of wrists and swaying of the torso in a woman's dance might have narrative significance too. Many Uyghur dances are meant to visually represent themes like a blooming flower, a flying dove flowing water, all common metaphors in folk poetry. In more theatrical forms, though, dancers might literally act out a story. Martial or torch dances, for instance, sometimes depict a line of young women each holding a lit candle or torch, representing souls or stars. Older folk in the audience might recall a tale about guiding spirits through the darkness. At weddings and parties, it's common for someone to perform a comical dance that caricatures a folktale character, say an old man hobbling like the foolish husband from a well-known joke, to everyone's amusement. Thus, dance isn't just entertainment, but it's a kind of folklore pantomime. Furthermore, it's integral to one of the most important folklore social institutions, the Meshrep. It's a traditional community gathering. Historically, especially among Uyghur men, it includes dance, music, oral storytelling, games, and moral discussion. It is part social party, part cultural salon. In a Meshrep, which might be hosted to mark a life event or just regularly in a village, participants will take turns in singing folk songs, playing instruments, or performing dances, often spontaneous and participatory. There is typically a host or Meshrep Bashi, the leader, who guides the proceedings, ensuring there's a balance of seriousness and comicness, of decorum and fun. Folktales and jokes, like the Nasruddin stories, are recounted by skilled raconteurs between the musical numbers. Dramatic skits might be improvised, where well-known local characters are gently parodied, similar to commedia dell'arte, I suppose. And crucially, dances serve as highlights. The famous Sama dance that concludes many Meshreps involves everyone forming a circle, clapping and dancing with increasing tempo, symbolizing unity and collective joy. The Meshrep thus encapsulates folklore in action. It is a living workshop where the community creates, performs, and passes on its cultural stories and values. And because of its vital role in sustaining Uyghur heritage, it was inscribed by UNESCO in 2010 on the list of intangible cultural heritage in need of urgent safeguarding. Alright, so Uyghur folklore has also found expression in folk theatre forms too, and one historic example is the Koshap and Orip storytellers, essentially duos who performed humorous dialogues and skits in markets. These comic dialogues often featured one straight man and one clown, something like vaudeville acts, I suppose, and their content drew heavily on folk tales and daily life anecdotes. In the early 20th centuries, traveling performers would stage scenes from romantic epics or humorous folk tales in makeshift theaters, accompanied by musicians. An observer in the 1920s in Kashgar might have seen a rough stage with performers reenacting the story of Laila and Majnun, or dramatizing a local legend about a trickster deceiving a judge, complete with props and costumes. This was a way to bring stories to life visually. Although formal Uyghur opera or theater in a European sense developed later under Soviet and Chinese influence, its roots lie in these folk performances. And to this very day, Elements of folklore storytelling can be seen in Maishara, a traditional one-woman comedic act, where a female performer humorously lectures the crowd on morality, peppering her speech with proverbs, folk songs, and impersonations of community members. Similarly, Darwas, tightrope walking, that is a revered Uyghur folk art that, while primarily acrobatic, often involves a performance with narrative elements. The tightrope walker might play a character, say a heroic figure, crossing a high bridge, or exchange banter with a clownish character on the ground in between feats, essentially adding a story context to the stunt. The Uyghurs also have an age-old tradition of oral poetry that often blurs song and story. The Makam system we discussed is one high example, but on the different, more grassroots level, there's also more simple folk songs, kushek or yerche, that tell short tales or moral lessons. A farmer might sing a little song while working in the field about a lazy fox who ends up hungry, a cautionary fable in melodic form. Lullabies sung by mothers incorporate folk beliefs and small stories to soothe the child. Some lullabies tell of cradle visited by angels or relate the tale of a baby nightingale that will grow strong. Work songs like those sung during communal building of an irrigation canal or at a mulberry harvest often contain call and response lyrics with proverbial wisdom or references to historical migrations and ancestors' deeds. Now, one unique genre of oral narrative poetry is the mashapishe, essentially extended, humorous or satirical poems recited at mishreps or gatherings. These could be improvised verses, teasing specific people, or even commending social issues in a veiled form, commentating. Such oral poets had to be quick-witted and culturally knowledgeable, drawing on a reservoir of folktale and references to make up clever rhymes on the spot. It's all about making the audience laugh, but ultimately at the end, having them walk away with something to think about too. The key takeaway from all these performance aspects is that Uyghur folklore is not confined to text or simple oral narration, but is rather a performative, communal experience. Music and dance in particular, they were the most powerful carriers of tradition. They engage emotions directly. The body movement in a dance can symbolize concepts without words, making the story accessible for those who might not even speak the language. Of course, it's always a sight to behold if you get to see one of these performances. But of course, beyond all the grand epics and jokes, there was also the beliefs about superstitions and those small little customs that shaped daily life. Still do. These elements of intangible culture, from protective charms and seasonal festivals, they might not always be stories in a narrative sense, but they are rich with symbolic meaning and often have their own little tales and legends behind them. In Uyghur folk belief, the natural and supernatural worlds are closely intertwined. Many Uyghurs traditionally accepted the existence of invisible beings that share a world with humanity. An inheritance from the ancient shamanistic and later Islamic cosmologies. One common category of such beings is the jinn, known in Islamic lore as spirits that can either be good or evil and are made of smokeless fire. In rural Uyghur communities, people long held that jinn could inhabit deserted places, empty buildings, or even specific large trees and graves. If someone fell ill quite suddenly or misfortune struck a household out of nowhere, it might be attributed to offending a jinn or an evil spirit. Folklore offers a myriad preventative forms to protect yourself from these unseen forces. For example, to ward off jinn, Uyghur mothers would hang a pouch wrapped in bright-colored cloth called a ponchak on a tree near their home or on a child's cradle. Kind of like how we'd hang up a horseshoe, this kind of thing. Inside the pouch could be found bits of incense, Quran verses on paper, or even garlic, a blend of Islamic and pre-Islamic protective symbols. Now, fire, that has an especially important role in folk spirituality. Uyghurs would sometimes use fire to purify or protect, an old custom during certain ceremonies, say, moving into a new house or during the spring Nuruz festival, was to light a small fire of juniper or poplar wood and have family members pass through the smoke or jump over the flames. The folk reasoning was that fire, being sacred since Tengris times, burns away impurity and scares off the evil spirit. The Uyghurs' landscape is also dotted with mazar, or shrine, sites, tombs of reputed saints, Sufi masters, or local heroes, which have been focal points of pilgrimage and rich sources of legend. Visiting these shrines and participating in their associated festivals has been an integral custom, blending Islamic piety with folk belief in the saints' intercession. Many of the shrines carry their own legends. For example, the Mazar of Imam Asim in the Taklamakan desert is honored with the annual pilgrimage and ritual circling. The legend goes that Imam Asim was a warrior saint who fought infidels in ancient times. He was martyred in the desert, and a sandstorm miraculously buried his enemies, forming the sand dunes around his tomb. Pilgrims recount how people go with pure intentions to Imam Asim's shrine, often witness small miracles or have their prayers answered. A barren woman might finally conceive after praying there. A sick child might get better. That kind of thing. Another example is the Ordam Padishar Mazar near Kashgar, which local lore identifies with the legendary Islamic hero Ali, or another early saint. Folklore describes celestial lights or guardian owls seen around the shrine at night, protecting it from desecration. And then there is the seasonal festivals and the life cycle customs. The turning of seasons and life milestones are accompanied by customs rich in folklore. Take Nowruz, the spring equinox New Year celebrated widely in Central Asia and among Uyghurs as well. Nowruz among the Uyghurs historically included preparing a special stew with 7 ingredients, cleaning homes, and youth gathering to sing and dance the night before. Folklore explains Nowruz as the day when the sun smiles and the earth is reborn. A charming local superstition says that on Nowruz morning, one should go outside and step on a piece of green grass while making a wish, because on that day, grass can hear your heart's desire and convey it to the spirits of the earth. Another custom is that when young girls hang colorful eggs from flowering trees, and the story would be told about how those represent the eggs of a mythical bird that brings prosperity. Similarly, harvest time in late summer had the first fruits feast. When tasting the first grapes of the seasons, people utter blessings and tell the story how a saint, sometimes Al-Qadir, the Green One, taught people agriculture and blessed the fruit of the land. These narratives tie human activities to a sacred timeline or mythical past, and it gives meaning to a recurring natural cycle. So when it comes to weddings, too, Uyghur customs are laid with symbolic acts and sayings. Before a bride enters the groom's house, a family might hold a mirror in front of her or sprinkle water behind her. Folklore says this is to confuse any evil spirit trailing her and to ensure she brings light and clarity into her new home. The practice of the bride crying in a special melodic way before leaving her parents' house, known as yiglash, is a ritualized expression accompanied by improvised crying songs, where she laments leaving her home. Now, as for births, one can find a host of old wives' tales and rituals too. After a baby is born, a knife or piece of iron might be placed by the cradle to cut off any evil spirit. a relic of the old shamanic belief in iron's protective power. There's an endearing custom of the cradle thief, too. In some villages, an older woman from the father's side will playfully steal the newborn's cradle and hide it, demanding treats or a small ransom. The folklore behind this is that long ago a grandmother saved her grandchild from an actual kidnapper by hiding the baby in a basket, and now the act is just remembered as a harmless prank. Now, of course, we can't talk about birth without death, and even in mourning, there's a little sprinkling of folklore. Now, while the Islamic practice prescribes certain rites, Uyghur folk customs added on gestures and beliefs. For example, spilling a bit of water at the doorstep after a funeral procession leaves, rather. People say it helps the departing soul cross into the next world. Kind of like providing them with a road of water, I suppose. Some might quietly recount a legend of the soul's journey, i.e. the soul will cross a bridge as narrow as a hair, with their good deeds turned into light to guide them. Just better hope that your good deeds were enough. This imagery is not quite directly Quranic, but it is derived from local imagination and perhaps Central Asian Buddhist afterlife concepts, just adapted to the Islamic tradition a little more. On the 7th and 40th days after death, families hold memorial meals, where aside from prayers, they ensure to tell a few anecdotes celebrating the deceased's life, effectively turning that person into just another element of folklore for the community. Now, if the person was particularly virtuous, sometimes little legends would spring up. Etc. claimed that a green bird landed on their grave, a sign of a soul's peace, or that they appeared in someone's dream giving wise advice. Stories like that usually help the living relatives cope and accord the death as a respected place in communal memory. And that's where we'll end it, with the death part today. We've certainly learned a lot about Uyghur folklore. It's unique, I suppose, in its own ways. And, well, the folklore videos are just going to keep coming. So if you're enjoying them, let me know and tell your friends too. In any case, let's thank the top tier patrons, shall we? And supporters both on YouTube and Patreon. Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Gary, Charlene, Lynn Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulford Near, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuronerd, Erin, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stefan, Kevin, HMSHH, Crystal, Talvery, Anthony, Lucy, Brandon, Gukububonic, Nicholas, Craig, Neftis, Alexander, Gokan, Dorsey, Benita, Claire, Courtesy, Carol, Robert, Mary, Bridget, Nefertari, Yvette, Miss Mochi, 11, Allison, Free American, Jennifer, Brittany, David, Cody, Brian, Are You My Mum, Rhonda, Carrie, Caddy P, and Lovely. All right, that's enough for one day, unless you want to go watch another video, in which case you do that. Anyway, good night, everyone. As always, lots of love to you all. Thank you for watching, and I will see you whenever you feel like coming back. You know where I'll be, right here on YouTube, waiting for you. Farewell for now.